Okay, I just mostly want to welcome everybody and thank you folks at Efficiency Vermont for collaborating with us. So, another important thing is to say this is part of an effort that the Energy Committee, the Norwich Energy Committee, is doing called Electrify Everything. So I want to note that we have a lot of resources that we put, so it covers housing and transportation and a lot of other topics as well. So we've collected a lot on our website, and I am just now going to put in the chat our a little shorthand URL for that. So please, I encourage people to look at that and explore and browse. And the other thing that I also want to let you know, this is a very good thing. So we've advertised this as an hour-long webinar, and I know it's lunchtime, so people may need to leave at 1, but I know from Becca and Jake that they're available past 1. So if you're able to stay, and if you still have a question that hasn't been answered, know that they're going to be around and can keep going until we've answered all questions possible. So thank you, and go ahead, Becca. Thank you. I'm going to mute myself now.
Awesome. Thank you, Linda. And thank you so much for just to the Norwich Energy Committee and your particular great work. It's so fabulous in my role at Efficiency Vermont to be able to work closely with energy committees. And we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do without your support and without your in the community kind of grassroots work that you do every day. So thanks for that. And I'm going to jump right in and oops, are you seeing the presentation? Yay, Jake's nodding. A success already in the day. Okay. Oops, now you're seeing the wrong presentation. Now you're seeing the correct presentation. Okay, here we go. So first off, thank you so much for joining. Again, I'm going to kick it off by telling you a little bit about the work we do at Efficiency Vermont. And then I'm going to hand it off to Jake Marin, who's going to actually give you the details you want about heat pumps. And a couple things to know for the presentation today. You are going to have the opportunity to ask questions in a lot of different ways. So if you are on your Zoom and you see some options at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A option and there's a chat feature. You're welcome to enter questions into the Q&A section or the chat feature. In addition to that, something we're going to try out today, so please bear with me, it might be fun, is if you have a question that you want to say out loud, that you want to be on camera for and that you want to ask us, just raise your blue hand when we complete the presentation and I'll call on people and we'll promote you to panelists so that you can talk directly to us and ask your question. Might be a bit more of a conversation. So if you've got something that you're not quite sure how to word or you want to ask it using your voice and not your keyboard, we are going to try to make space for that at the end. So good luck. We'll see how it goes. And I do already see that we've got some stuff in the chat, so that's great. So thank you for doing that. We'll try to capture those when we get to the end of the presentation, or if it makes sense and it's relevant, we might even respond during. Okay, so a little bit about Efficiency Vermont. I'm a community engagement manager, so it's my entire job to help spread the word about the work we do. And you'll see on this slide a couple of photos of what we do, whether it be giving information about energy efficiency upgrades, working one-on-one with a small business or a customer, an individual, a nonprofit, community group like your energy committee, your municipality. Really, we're here to serve every Vermonter and help them be able to access the things that they want to do when it comes to energy efficiency. So that can take a lot of work, but we're here to do it. So the goal is to reduce your energy costs. And a little bit about Efficiency Vermont. When we talk about the investment we make in Vermont, it's pretty clear to me when I look at these numbers, we actually get back more than we put in when we talk about efficiency, meaning the amount that we put in to cover improving our efficiency, to save money on energy. We see that coming back and actually saving Vermonters money for that $1 for every invested. We see $2 in return. So pretty cool. And moving beyond money, we also think a lot about how we can lower our emissions. And carbon comes into that. So I really like this last blurb you can see right here, which talks about how we make an impact when it comes to removing metric tons of carbon in our state. So today you're going to learn again a little bit about who we are, and then we're going to dive into the heat pumps piece. So not only do I get to work with my colleagues at Efficiency Vermont, but we work really closely and partner with all sorts of different outfits, including your electric utility. If you're from Norwich and you're joining this webinar online from your home in the Upper Valley, then you're likely a Green Mountain Power customer. So that would be your electric utility. We also have a diverse network of contractors who are a part of the EEN or the Efficiency Excellency Network. And then last but certainly not least, we work closely with some credit unions. So just to highlight again, we're an EU or an efficiency utility, which is a special descriptor for the work that we do, meaning we're still regulated like a public utility. And we are your hub for all sorts of information. Again, if you're Green Mountain Power customers, this would be who your electric utility is. If you're from other parts of the state, you might have Washington Electric, Vermont Electric. You might have your small municipal utility being your provider. Or you could be from anywhere in the state, wherever you get your electricity. That's what we're talking about here. And then again, that contractor network and some credit unions. So we're going to talk a little bit about the financing at the end. So if you're thinking about a project when it comes to heat pumps, we do work closely with local credit unions. Okay, so now, drumroll please, you get to hear about heat pumps, what you came here for. So I'm going to pass the baton over to Jake. And if you wouldn't mind, Jake, I didn't fully introduce you. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about the work that you do and your title to set that up.
Great.
I just approved remote control, Jake. So,
oh, so I can, good. All right, before we jump into that, yes, thank you. So my name is Jake Marin. I work with Becca, of course, at Efficiency Vermont. Really psyched to be here talking to you guys today about one of my favorite topics, heat pumps. In fact, I'm often referred to as the heat pump guy at Efficiency Vermont. I've been with Efficiency Vermont now for almost 10 years. This August will be my 10-year anniversary, and I've been working with heat pumps since about 2013. So heat pumps are something that are definitely near and dear to my heart. I'm a program manager. I do all of the creation and management of all of our heat pump programs. So with that, now I seem to, oh, there it is, they've come back. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of science, and I don't want this one slide to scare anybody off, but so just take this ride with me. This is really the core of how a heat pump works. It's also important to understand that heat pumps are something that we are all very familiar with and have been living with for our whole lives, which an example of that is a refrigerator. So refrigerators, air conditioners, what we tend to think of as heat pumps, ductless mini splits, these are all different versions of the same thing, and they all work off of one basic concept, which is called the refrigerant cycle. And so the refrigerant cycle starts with a couple of major components. We've got an evaporator and we've got a condenser. Now, I don't want this to confuse people if you think about, well, where are the two different parts? I know one is outside and one is inside. which is which. Well, it's a little confusing with heat pumps because heat pumps actually switch the location depending on whether or not you are, it's really switching the operation, but the functional evaporator and functional condenser do change depending on whether you're heating your space or you're cooling it. So just to start off, let's assume that the evaporator, since air conditioning is really where all this started, let's assume the evaporator is inside the house. And that is the heat source. That is where you actually have more heat than you want there to be. And then you have a heat sink, which is where you might want to ditch that heat, get rid of that heat, and that's outside the building. So you've got this evaporator. Let's start there. So it's also important to acknowledge that there's the connection between that evaporator and that condenser, that indoor and outdoor component, is some piping filled with a material called a refrigerant. And this is really just a transfer medium. It's just a material that we can heat up and cool down and heat up and cool down. We don't use up refrigerant. It's all just in the system. And as long as the system doesn't leak out, it should stay there for the life of the equipment. So the first step is that refrigerant comes in as a liquid into the evaporator. And it's a chilled liquid. And so when it gets to the evaporator, it's absorbing heat. It actually boils that refrigerant, causes it to actually, evaporate, become a gas, right? That's where the evaporator piece comes from. So the refrigerant is running through that coil you see in the form of a spiral here, absorbing heat from the space it's in, your living room, for example. It then moves throughout the refrigerant piping to a compressor. The compressor is something like a bike pump or an air compressor. All this is doing is increasing the pressure of that gas that's coming, that refrigerant gas that comes into it. And when you increase, if you think back to high school science, when you increase pressure, you also increase temperature. Again, if you think about a bike pump, as you begin to pump up your tire, if you feel your pump actually gets hot, it's because as you increase pressure, temperature also increases. So when you then take the, there it comes. You're then taking that pressurized hot gas to your condenser. And the condenser really functionally is almost identical, or really pretty much is identical to the evaporator. It's just a coil and with a fan. And the coil, in that case, you're bringing this hot gas in. And what happens is it's dumping into a relatively cooler space. So you're rejecting heat. You're dumping all that heat that you have, in this case, out into the outdoor air. What ends up then happening is that the refrigerant gas, as it cools down, actually condenses, becomes a liquid again. So we've gone through a phase change. And what kind of part of the magic here is that as materials go through phase change, they actually either absorb or reject large amounts of energy, which is what we're using physics to our advantage. So from here, this cooled liquid refrigerant goes into something called an expansion valve. And all that really does is release the pressure that we have built up in the system. And when you release pressure, what ends up happening is we actually have, it cools down, right? It's the inverse of the increased pressure causing it to warm up. Reduced pressure causes it to cool down. We then have a cool liquid refrigerant comes into the evaporator, and the whole process repeats. So that is the magic behind the curtain. And as one of our attendees said, how does this really work? It's magic. And I think the truth is you can talk about the science all day, and Bob's right. It really truly is magic. And so the only thing I'll say here is it is important to acknowledge that this system, of course, when you want to heat in the building, it just switches. The heat source becomes the outdoor air, and the heat sink becomes the house. Talk a little bit more about this in a bit. And of course, the efficiency piece is a critical component of why we are huge proponents of heat pumps. For 1 kilowatt hour of electricity we put in, we're actually getting 3 kilowatt hours of heat energy out. If we were talking about electric resistance heat, that would be 1 kilowatt hour in, 1 kilowatt hour out. So we're really kind of leveraging electricity to run an operation, which is to just move heat from one location to another. And because of that, we get these incredible efficiencies that are really not realizable in any other kind of heating system. Okay, so that's the science piece. I know that was a lot, but hopefully getting back to some stuff that's a little bit more relatable to you all. So to start off, if you look at the number on the left, 30,000, this is the number of heat pumps that we've installed in Vermont. So this is not a new technology to Vermonters. I told you I've been working on this since 2013. We've seen dramatic increase in adoption, and people really love their heat pumps. 14,000, the number on the right, is the number of, you can use this same technology to heat water. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, not a new technology, things that Vermonters are adopting at a really regular pace. So I want to dispel some myths about heat pumps. These are questions or comments that come up all the time, every time we have conversations about heat pumps. For one, there's a sense or a notion that heat pumps don't really work when it gets, really cold outside. Is that fact or is that fiction? And I will say that although that used to be true, that is no longer true. So we are now seeing heat pumps, and this is improving all the time. We are now seeing heat pumps that can put out 100% of their rated capacity, right? The amount of heat that they can put out, down to even -5 degrees. And they will continue operating really to any temperature that we would ever see in Vermont, -20, 30. They do lose efficiency and some output capacity when they get down into those super cold temperatures, but they can continue to put out a lot of heat. And there's a bunch of technology reasons why this is: better controls, something called enhanced vapor injection. But suffice to say, the technology is not your grandmother's heat pump. There's also a notion that if I, move to electric heat by getting a heat pump, it's going to just, increase my electric bill. And although that is true, and you should anticipate that if you put in a heat pump, you will see an increase in your electric bill. You will also see a corresponding reduction in your fuel bill because you will be running it a lot less. Heat pumps cannot or will not fully heat a whole home. Using the displacement model, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean there, they don't need to, right? So you don't need to be concerned about a heat pump's ability to heat a whole home if you use a certain approach that I'm a big proponent of. That said, if you have a properly weatherized building, especially newer buildings, we are seeing a lot of them run exclusively on heat pumps without any other kind of backup or supplemental heating. So, jumping into the next section here, this is just to sort of show you what heat pumps are healthier than gas or wood. Absolutely something that a lot of people are in agreement with you, Nikki, on that one. So as far as different types of heat pumps, so just to run through, we all may have an image of what heat pumps look like in our head, but there are actually many different types of heat pumps, and I'm talking about heat pumps for heating your home, heating and cooling your home. So this is a schematic or just the basic concept around a ductless heat pump. As per the name ductless, there are no ducts. You have an outdoor unit that sits usually on a stand or on a bracket tied to the side of the house, and then you'll have some sort of indoor unit not utilizing ductwork that just directly kind of heats and cools the space inside. Can be mounted on the wall, mounted on the floor, mounted inside the ceiling. There's all sorts of options, but these are all versions of what we call ductless heat pumps. And again, of course, we know that these can heat and cool. And this gives you a visual of what the outdoor component looks like with these ductless heat pumps. In fact, this is really what kind of most of heat pumps look like, whether they're ductless or not. The outside part tends to look something like this. It's really, you're seeing that either big square or circular hole is for the fan. And then you can kind of see a little bit into the coil on the inside. This is where that refrigerant tubing runs. There's usually some aluminum fins on there just to increase surface area, get better heat exchange, but it's really nothing much in there, a little bit of extra electronics. This is where the compressor lives. So a lot of the electronics and the components are outside. This is what some of the indoor options look like. The most ubiquitous are these wall mount units. You can see the gentleman from Vermont Energy mounting one on a wall, high wall. But the bottom left, you can see there's floor mount units as well. We don't have any pictures here of ceiling mounts. There are ones that look kind of like the ones that go on the wall, but they hang on the ceiling. There are others that are recessed ceiling, so they're flush with the finished ceiling. So there are, again, a lot of different options. So in addition to the ductless heat pumps that are really sort of forms of space heaters, kind of like a Rinnai or something might be, there's also ducted heat pumps. So with ducted heat pumps, the outdoor piece looks very similar, or can look very similar. Instead of bringing into a unit that hangs on your wall or on your ceiling, you're actually tying into ductwork, which can have some really great, interesting benefits. For one, you don't have anything hanging on your wall or mounted on your floor, which can be, for a lot of people, something they really find distasteful, the look of these things hanging in their nice spaces. So by tying into your ductwork, you don't have to look at those things. The other advantage to ducted heat pumps, of course, is that you're kind of spreading that heat around. The ductwork can carry the heating and cooling throughout the entire building. And these come in all different flavors and sizes, enough to do a couple of rooms to an entire home type system. We also now have an emerging technology called air-to-water heat pumps. Again, the outside piece looks very similar to what pictures I just showed you. The difference here is that instead of either heating up the air and blowing around heated or cooled air, you're actually heating or chilling water and moving water throughout your building in the way that you would have radiators or radiant floors. So this is something we're really excited about. A lot of homes that have what we call hydronic or hot water distribution systems can take advantage of air-to-water heat pumps. And really probably the premium system that we have out in the market are ground source, or often referred to as geothermal heat pumps. These are not using things like hot springs or anything like that. It's using a traditional heat pump, pulling heat energy from normal ground. And the ground loop is often done vertically in the ground, several hundred feet in through one or more wells. These ground source heat pumps can heat. The difference here is you don't have a heat pump outside. Your heat pump sits in your basement, and it's just pulling the heat out of that fluid that moves through the ground loop. The cool thing here is these can tie into ductwork or into hot water. So there's really a lot of opportunities here, and these are what we see as some of the best performing systems out there. Okay, so hot water, I mentioned that you can use heat pumps to do hot water, and I bet there are folks that are on this webinar who already have one of these units. We know there's, like we said, about 15,000 of these spread out amongst Vermont. I own one in my own home. I have one in a rental property, a couple of rental properties that I have. These are great. And what's really cool about them is that they're what we call a package system, meaning that the heat pump and the water tank, storage tank, are really kind of all in one. They're, the black part in the picture here is the heat pump, and the gray part below is the water storage tank. So you don't have to run any piping. This is just an appliance that usually you just bring into your basement, plug in, and is kind of a one-for-one swap out for either a fuel-fired or an electric water heater. They use a fraction of the electricity that you would use as compared to an electric water heater. And they have this really cool side benefit of dehumidifying your space, especially if you're putting it in a basement. That can be something that's really great to have. So why would we install a heat pump system? So one of the, the really obvious one is for a lot of people looking to reduce their carbon footprint. People are putting on solar panels, they're, buying electric cars. This is another opportunity that we have to reduce our energy consumption and reduce our carbon footprint. So by moving to heat pumps, Vermont has a very renewable electric generation supply. So there is a substantial reduction in your carbon footprint by moving from a oil or propane or gas-fired heating equipment over to heat pumps. Of course, there is quite a bit of opportunity to save money as well through the efficiency of this equipment, depending on fuel costs and what you're comparing to. There's definitely quite a bit of opportunity to save money on your energy bills. And a lot of people really love heat pumps because of the comfort that they provide. So in addition to getting air conditioning where you may not have had air conditioning before, or being able to get rid of that annoying window air conditioner that breaks your back and gets nasty, air conditioner water all over your feet every time you pull it out of the window or put it in every year. These are permanent installations. But in addition to the air conditioning side, all of this equipment is what we call inverter driven. That's just a fancy way of saying that it modulates up and down to meet a really, really steady temperature in the space. Most traditional heating systems are run by a thermostat. When the set point is not being reached, they kick on at full blast. They blast heat at you till they reach or exceed the set point, and then they shut off. And so it's an on, off, versus heat pumps. They come on, they find sort of their happy place, and they just sort of hum along to maintain a really, really steady, comfortable temperature. So achieving comfort, sometimes bringing heat or cooling to areas that don't have adequate heating and cooling is another reason why people install heat pumps. So as far as next steps, there are some things absolutely to consider. So one of the first things that we do consider is, what is the building envelope like, the building shell, from a weatherization perspective? Weatherizing first is something we absolutely encourage. Heat pumps are going to not only perform better, but you're going to be that much more comfortable and use that much less energy in your building to keep yourself comfortable. So we absolutely would love to help you out with any concerns you have about the level of weatherization of your building. And so that's something that we definitely encourage, is looking at that before jumping into the HVAC side, the heating equipment side with heat pumps. Equipment selection and installation. So as with any heating system, picking the right system for your needs is really critical, right? So we need to make sure that you're getting what it is that meets what you're trying to accomplish. In other words, are you thinking about primarily cooling and doing shoulder season heating, right? Just spring and fall. Are you looking to move to net zero and get completely off of fossil fuels? That's going to mean some very different steps in terms of equipment selection. Installation best practices are something we work closely with our EEN contractors. Becca mentioned the EEN earlier. Absolutely encourage you to work with these EEN contractors. These are the folks that we work with closely to ensure that they have the training, the knowledge, the experience to do proper equipment selection and installation. So to find an EEN contractor, you can go to the Efficiency Vermont website. On the upper right tab, you see Find a Contractor or Retailer. You can type in that you're looking for a contractor, type in heat pump, and you'll get a list of contractors based on zip code, essentially their proximity to where you are. So the other thing I think is really key to point out is that we're here to support you in any way, in many ways. And of course, financially is always a really critical piece to kind of overcome that first cost, right? We know you can save money operating the equipment, but some of this equipment can be really expensive. So we do have some great incentives right now, probably better than they've ever been. For ductless and ducted heat pumps, as well as those heat pump water heaters, we have a great program in place with all of the distributors in the state, the wholesalers that sell this equipment. We have, we're discounting the cost of that equipment right there at the point of purchase. So ductless heat pumps, you can get up to $450. Ducted, something we're really promoting, you can get up to $2,000 off. And water heaters are up to $600 is the most common. On the rebate side, and what we mean by this is you pay for the installation and then you submit to us and we reimburse you. We help to offset the cost after the project is completed. For the air to water equipment that I mentioned, because this is still sort of new and we understand that that's a bit of a stretch for folks and they can be very expensive projects. There is up to $6,000 off those systems. So that's a tremendous rebate. Highly encourage you to take advantage of. The ground source heat pumps that we mentioned, I don't have a number to share yet. That's a program that is currently in development. And please check back with us in the next couple of months if that's something that you're interested in moving forward with. But we are looking at some very, very aggressive rebates to really move this market as much as we can. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity with ground source heat pumps. And then for water heaters that are purchased through retail outlets or online, we do have a $600 rebate for those heat pump water heaters, the same ones that get the instant discount. You can't double that up. It's either or, but we have both of those available depending on the channel that you get access. So Becca mentioned financing. We have the home energy loan. I don't know if any of you have ever taken advantage of this. This is really for residential homeowners who are looking to do heat pumps and other weatherization and advanced wood heating systems. We have some really great streamlined financing that we have bought down the interest rates on. So your interest rate will depend, you can see in the matrix here, depend on your family income. But again, really, really great program. I've personally gone through it. You can often get approved for your loan literally within hours. I think they guarantee within something like 24 hours. And with that, I think we are to our Q&A section. And I do know, Becca, I don't know if you want to come back on and facilitate that, or if you want me to just jump on that.
There we go. Yes. Okay. I think we're all set. I'll go ahead and start facilitating. Great job, Jake. Thank you. I always learn something new, and I'll say I have a heat pump in my house. So, okay. So. So again, if folks want to ask a question and they want to say it to us, you can raise your blue hand and I'll try to promote you to panelists. But for now, looks like we've got some questions in the chat, and you can also ask a question in the Q&A. So the first question I see is from Matthew Christie, and he says, do you have brands yet of cold climate functional air to water heat pumps that can get to 190 degrees Fahrenheit for existing hydronic distribution retrofits? So a simple, straightforward one for you to kick it off. Thank you for asking the question, Matthew.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is no. where the technology right now is really almost all the equipment that we're seeing is focused on low water temperature distribution. So really the lower the better, which is why during that section, I didn't say thin tube baseboard, I said radiant floors. Low temperature distribution is really key at this point in the technology development. So 190, frankly, we shouldn't have systems being designed at all for 190 degrees. Usually 170 to 180 is about what we see for thin tube baseboard. Some as high as 190, but you're getting into some real inefficiencies in system operation, even for traditional heating systems. So we're big advocates of low temperature distribution systems. They can be retrofit. It can be very expensive. It is a challenge, absolutely. Air to water heat pumps are not plug and play for many, many homeowners because they do not have the distribution system to support their, that type of low temperature water. And when I say low temperature, I'm talking about, 100 to 120 degrees is really optimal. Most of these air to water systems kind of cap out at 140 degrees. So, but again, you're going to see a pretty significant performance drop, efficiency drop if you try to put out 140 degree water. You really want to be in that kind of 100 and 110 sweet spot. So radiant floors are really the way to go, or radiant panels. There's some good opportunities for that. So.
Thank you, Jake. And I see we have a few questions coming in.
Actually, before we leave that topic, I do want to have one more point out on that. There are new systems that are being developed. We've been holding out hope for a number of years that we would see kind of a plug and play system that could put out that 170, 180 degree water temperature so that we open up to the vast majority of people for retrofits. There are new systems using actually a carbon dioxide refrigerant that do have the capability of putting out those kind of water temperatures. There are no products available in the United States right now that have that capability, but they do exist. So stay tuned and come back in a year or 2 years and we'll do another session and see if we have updates for you.
Thank you, Jake. And we've got a bunch of questions, so I really appreciate everyone engaging. I'll start by saying we have had a few questions about getting contact information and the slide deck. We can certainly provide the slide deck for you. And rather than giving you Jake's email, I have one better for you, which is we can sign you up for a virtual home energy visit, which is a free home energy visit with an Efficiency Vermont energy consultant who will talk to you about, they can really talk to you about heat pumps, but they can also talk to you about your whole home and where you might have other potential opportunities for efficiency. So I'm going to put that information in there, and I'm also going to put my contact information. So if you do have something specific you want to ask, I can try to find the right person at Efficiency Vermont. So going to answer that question. And the slide deck, I'll make sure that we send that out. If you registered today, you will have your email. So if you registered with an email, you should get it. And then I see a question from Ellen. She says, is it as easy as swapping out existing traditional electric water heaters with a heat pump hot water heater?
So mostly the power, the wiring, all of the plumbing is all the same. There are a couple of small differences. One difference is I mentioned that they dehumidify the space. What ends up happening is that in the case of the water heater, you have the condenser is essentially wrapped around the tank, and then the evaporator is a little coil that sits in that top portion and that gets really cold, right? We talked about that. You have a cold liquid refrigerant there, and so long story short, you can have condensate. The condensation will form there, and it has to be piped into a drain. Otherwise, you just end up dripping it all back over the floor and don't get any benefit of dehumidification. So that's the biggest difference. Noise can be a concern. I saw another question about noise. So maybe I'll just address noise kind of all in one. Heat pump water heaters have gotten quieter and quieter and quieter. That said, if there's one thing I've learned working with customers related to heat pumps and sound is that everybody really has a very different threshold of what noise is considered a nuisance to them. So all heat pumps do have compressors in them, so they make noise. And heat pump water heaters now have gotten so quiet, I always liken them to like the sound that a dehumidifier makes. So if you're familiar with that sound, that's about on par what most heat pump water heaters sound like. That said, they're now kind of in these insulated boxes, and the newer ones, you kind of have to go up super close and put your ear up to it to even hear, has been my experience. But again, I'm not going to tell you they don't make noise, because some people it drives crazy. I have 2 young children. I listen to them scream all day long. I'd never hear my heat pump water heater. So it's an issue of personal not sensitivity, I guess. As far as the heat pumps that sit in your space, again, you only have the evaporator for space heating. You generally only have the evaporator or the non-compressor portion of it. So it's really just a fan. And they are extremely quiet fans. You can hear a little bit of noise from like just the sound of the refrigerant in there, kind of like gurgly noises. Becca, you might be able to speak to your own personal experience with that. It's never bothered me, but again, I live on Route 2 on a busy road and hear a lot of noise. So if I lived in a really pristine, quiet environment, it might bother me more.
Well, I appreciate your candor on that one, Jake. That's a question I've gotten before too. And I'm going to put in the chat a blog post that we actually have from Efficiency Vermont that talks a little bit about how you might make the decision around choosing a heat pump if it's right for you. And personally, I would say we have had no reaction to the noise of our heat pump hot water heater. And then being in buildings with heat pumps, yes, you can hear them if you're looking, I would say, for the sound. But there was you can actually find online if you're really interested, versus, before COVID, when you might be able to go to a friend's house and kind of listen to theirs. There are YouTube clips of heat pumps making noises, and you really have to get pretty close or turn your volume up pretty high to get a sense of the noise. So if you want to know more about that, I recommend checking out the blog post I just put in the chat, and some YouTube research might be in store. Okay, tons of questions, so let's keep going. And I see a lot of folks are asking questions specific to their homes. So again, signing up for that virtual home energy visit, free service from Efficiency Vermont, might be a helpful tool. But let's go to a question we got in the chat earlier, which is, can you estimate the cost of installing individual heat pumps for apartment buildings, say per unit? And that question comes from Kurt.
So as you saw from the presentation on different kinds of heat pumps, there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. In apartment buildings, the most common that I've seen are what they call single zone ductless. So in that case, what you're talking about is one outdoor unit, one indoor unit, and usually like a wall mounted type of situation. So if we sort of restrict our thinking to just that scenario, before you start getting into sort of rebates and things like that, I think the average cost is around $3,500 to $5,000 in some cases, depending on the size of the unit. I've seen people do smaller units or certain brands or certain contractors where you can get down even as low as $2,500, but you're sort of in that range. I think the average is about $4,000.
Thank you, Jake. And we have a great list of our rebates on the Efficiency Vermont website too. So when you're thinking about that individual cost, certainly a great opportunity now when we think about the rebates available, as Jake mentioned. Okay, so we have another question here from John. John says, I have a 3-bedroom house with a finished basement. Can I manage with one pump upstairs and one downstairs, or would it take pumps at multiple points on each floor?
Yeah, these get really tricky to resolve without really getting into the details of, you know, what your building envelope is like and how broken up the space is in terms of internal partitions and what your existing distribution system is. So I can't answer that question directly. I will say that the more open a space is in terms of interior walls and closed doors and things like that, the more open it is, the better suited these kind of like wall or floor hung ductless units are. The more broken up your space, the more a distributed type system works better. So like a ducted system or an air to water system where you can really kind of get that to all the little rooms, because you're really depending on, you know, with a ductless heat pump, you're really depending on the heat to just kind of migrate its way through the building, and closed off areas or lots of interior walls really kind of slow that down. The other piece, of course, is how well weatherized the building is. If it's really, really well weatherized, super tight, super insulated, the heat will want to stay in the building and migrate around inside the building more than it will want to escape through the exterior walls or windows and doors. So it's definitely kind of a complicated thing to answer in this forum, but yeah, those are some things to keep in mind.
Thanks, Jake. And I do see we have a question similar to that, which is just asking about their specific home. So I see your question, Sandra, in the chat about having a traditional cape. So I think to Jake's point, if you've got a specific question, will it work? How will it work in my home with this type of room or this type of space? It's might be time to dive in and really figure out what works best for your home, because we're not going to be able to give you really hard numbers on if it will work for you. But we can give general advice, as Jake just did.
I will. One thing that I realized I had not included in the slides, but had intended to, I mentioned the displacement model. So what that means is that we tend to think of our heating system situation as, you know, do I use this system or that system? Meaning, if I have my existing system dies, do I get a new system that's a heat pump? What we're generally recommending for existing homes, if you're not building a new home or have a very new home, we're recommending keeping your existing heating system in place and using the heat pump to displace or offset your fossil fuel use to sort of the maximum extent that you can, the most cost effectively. So the most common scenario that we see is people have relatively open living spaces, and you know, the living, kitchen, dining kind of area, usually on the first floor of the home, and then a second floor that has lots of little bedrooms and bathrooms. That is, again, the most common, not everybody's house by any means. And in those situations, a heat pump located on the first floor is really the biggest bang for your buck. That's where you can get a lot of heating distributed throughout that big open space. Some of it migrates upstairs as well, and you're offsetting a substantial portion of your heating costs or your heating fuel to the heat pump, versus putting a little heat pump in every single room can get very, very expensive in the upstairs. So again, if you keep your existing heating system in place, you have a way to continue to heat those bedrooms or supplement the heating in those bedrooms. You can often get away with a single heat pump on the main floor to do the bulk of your heating.
Thank you, Jake. And I'm taking a little bit of what you said and typing it in as an answer for a few of our question askers. So thank you. Another question we got from Jay is, do ducted systems exchange the interior air, or does it just use outside air?
They are just recycling the indoor air. They're not ventilation systems unless you tie in supply air you tie outside air into the supply. Generally speaking, the way ducted systems work is the same way your furnace works. There's a return loop and a supply loop. And essentially the return is just taking the sort of ambient space air, 70 degrees, whatever it is in your space, bringing it back to the furnace, heating it up, usually using oil or propane or gas, but in this case, using the heat pump to heat the air and then sending it back out to the space. And the whole thing continues. Ventilation, outdoor air is a whole separate conversation that I would love to have in a future call. And incorporating the two is another matter altogether. It adds a lot of complexity. Generally speaking, we recommend keeping them separate.
Thank you for that answer. And something that we've had asked, Linda, our host, put it in the chat, and then we've also got the question in the Q&A section. And something I don't know the answer to, so I'm really intrigued. So heat pumps, they use a refrigerant. And for those of us who are kind of deep into some of the, I would say, understanding of emissions and climate change and the impacts, we're learning more that refrigerant emissions matter and have a carbon footprint. Could you talk a little bit about that side of things and the refrigerant that heat pumps use? And then we also got a question that asked if you have any understanding of a comparison between, let's say, your high efficiency air conditioner with a ductless heat pump, and if there's emissions understandings. If there's an understanding of the emissions for those.
I am so happy that somebody asked that question, or how it sounds like more than one person did. So this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart, especially as we see an dramatic increase in these types of systems being installed. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The refrigerant that's used in almost all heat pumps is something called R410A. R410A has, on a pound for pound basis compared to carbon dioxide, is over 2,000 times greater global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So we need to keep the refrigerant in the pipe. Now, keep in mind, we're not, unlike carbon dioxide, which is a intended byproduct of any combustion, refrigerant leakage only happens if something goes wrong. So it's not supposed to be being put in, it's not part of the regular emissions. It's only when improper installation happens or there's some kind of catastrophic failure of some sort. So we really do need to keep the refrigerant in the pipe. We're doing a lot of work through the EEN to ensure that contractors have the training, tools, knowledge, skills to do good installations to keep that refrigerant in there. Plus, it's important, not just from an environmental perspective, but if the refrigerant leaks out, your system stops working. So there's an inconvenience layered on top of that. So keeping the refrigerant in the pipe is really our main tool that we have right now. But I will say that we are constantly keeping our eyes and ears open to any opportunities to move toward refrigerants that have less environmental impact potential. So we're keeping our eye on that. As far as window air conditioners, ultimately what they're using a lot of the same refrigerants, so it's really comparable. The difference has to do with charge size. It's how much refrigerant's in the system. And that's a function of how big of a system it is. So, you know, there's always going to be a little bit more in a ductless system or any kind of split system, because you have all that piping that's full of refrigerant as well. So yeah, probably definitely more potential for leakage on a split system, meaning these ductless systems, than on a window air conditioner.
Jake, I really appreciate you responding to that question, because as I mount my computer, I have it on top of the Drawdown, edited by Paul Hawkins, and one of the first things that they talk about is refrigeration and how we can, as individuals, be accountable for how we use refrigerants. So I appreciate you giving that information to us. And yeah, there's that double edge. If it's leaking, it's probably not working, and it's also bad for the environment. So I
also think it's worth pointing out that in all the analyses that we've done, looking at, you know, the difference between, let me just say, with heat pumps, if you're using a heat pump to offset the, you know, burning fossil fuel, there's carbon savings there, right? So we really have to think about if you look at the average amount that leaks out, you have to look at the comparison of what are you saving versus what are you adding back in, sort of like what's the net difference. And every analysis that's been done, not just by us, but by anyone that I've ever seen, has shown a very dramatic savings, carbon savings, even with the unintended leakage that does come from these. We can do better. We're gonna do better, but we're still coming out way, way ahead for anybody who's really concerned about this.
And looking that's close to 1, and I know we've got some time that we can dedicate to answer some more questions. If anyone has a question and they know, hey, I really had to go right at 1, feel free again to raise your hand and I'll promote you. But I'm going to go through the questions as received otherwise. Okay, so quick one from anonymous attendee. I got an estimate for Arctic air to water heat pumps that uses a newer version of the equipment than what is referenced in the equipment list for Efficiency Vermont's rebates. Are they still eligible? Do you mind if I take this one, Jake?
Please.
I highly recommend calling our customer support line if you're wondering about eligible product. And that would be my answer. But maybe you've got something that's more specific.
I think the answer is, in this case, I can just say yes, it's going to fall. We have, for our air to water program, we're really trying to transform a very nascent or sort of undeveloped market. And so we're very open. We work closely with Arctic. It's just what's probably happened is you're ahead of us on the curve of getting that added to our list. So as long as it's part of their standard line and it isn't something odd, then it should be fine. And I do encourage you to get this in writing by connecting through our customer support. That'll come to me probably, and it'll be a good trigger for me to check in with them and make sure that we have the most current list. And then you'll get back an official written. It's a lot of money. You want to make sure before you make the decision to move forward that it is eligible. But yes, I'm almost certain it will be.
Thanks, Jake. And I'll go ahead and put in the chat our customer support line. So if you'd like to call, you can. And I'll put in the website that you can, if you want to type it in as like an info request. There's a contact form we have on the page as well. Before I do that, let's give you another question to respond to. This, I like this question. I would almost save it for the end, but I think it's valuable to just call out now. Stephen asks, if one is starting with no heating system whatsoever, given the various options you've listed, what is the most efficient, least expensive option to install and operate?
What is that saying? Good, quick, and easy, pick 2, right? Like, so, yeah, it is hard to answer the question. There is no best answer. And I think it often just like any good consultant, questions are, whenever people ask me questions, I respond with questions back. My question back would be about what one's goals are, about what meaning are we looking to get 100% electrification or partial? Are we looking to do air conditioning, not air conditioning, including hot water, not including hot water, meaning domestic hot water? So, and my answer as far as which system to recommend would be different depending on what your answers are. But since this isn't a really convenient back and forth conversation, given the format, I will say that for the best efficiency, ground source heat pumps cannot be beat. They are also the only way in most homes to get to 100%, in many homes at least, to get to 100% electrification, no backup heating system. Of course, they don't hit the inexpensive button. That said, I know I couldn't give you any numbers, but what I will say is that there's going to be a program in place with the goal of getting ground source heat pumps on par with kind of a traditional heating system in terms of cost. So if we can achieve that, then I would say that that hits all of your, crosses all of your, checks all your boxes. That said, we are seeing very common in new construction, at least. That's usually the only place where you see no heating system, or something new construction-esque, heating a space that hasn't been heated before, can be done inexpensively with good, very good performance than air source heat pump. And that can be a variety of different, it can be ducted, it can be ductless. It just, again, depends on the type of building and how it's laid out and what the goals are.
Thank you. And then I like this question because I think the answer is a resounding yes, but are these low maintenance?
They,
oh, no.
They are, but they're not.
Maintenance I haven't been doing? Oh no.
They are not no maintenance. And I think that this is something that's been missing from a lot of our conversation about this, is it's magic in the way it operates, but it's not magic in the fact that it's still a piece of equipment that needs to be maintained. So some very regular maintenance that needs to happen, you'll see in much of the equipment. If you have any of these kind of wall mounted or floor mounted units, there are some filters that need to be cleaned. Not a big deal. You just wash them in usually wash them off in your sink or with a hose. That takes 2 minutes. They pop in, pop out. You don't need tools or anything like that. You also should be getting an annual cleaning. So the coil that I showed you, especially the outside, inside, some people, depending on if you have a lot of animals, particularly dusty house, smoke in the house, any of those kinds of things, you can have buildup on the coil inside as well. You have a pre-filter, but it doesn't get everything. So the coil, the ability of the unit to do its job, it needs to be able to exchange heat energy, both in the inside and outside, and they can get gunked up with stuff. And if they're gunked up with stuff, they will degrade in their performance over time. So every year you should really get them cleaned. It's not that complicated, but it's definitely something you want to have done professionally. They use specialized cleaners that don't mess things up. You can bend the little fins if you get too crazy with, like, people done them with pressure washers and then they bend all the fins. And so there's things you can mess up. So it's best, I think, to hire it out. They use certain, like I said, certain types of cleaners. I'm sure if you YouTube it, you'll figure out the right cleaner and the right type of equipment, and you could start doing it yourself. I'm a DIYer myself, and I know a lot of you probably are as well. So absolutely, it can be done, but generally speaking, recommend it done professionally.
I appreciate that. And that's such a Vermonter answer, to be a DIYer. We love to do it.
You know, half the people on this call are like, I could do that myself.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, so another question we had, which again, I don't think I've thought about it before, but a cool idea. So smart thermostats. Are smart thermostats useful for heat pumps, or is the steady state approach more efficient?
These are great questions. So this has been a question we've been getting for several years, because people either already have and often love their smart thermostat. I will say that there are some compatibility issues just to start. So even if there potentially were benefits, you often can't use your smart thermostat with your heat pump. That's not always the case, but it's definitely something that you need to look at. One thing that's been very frustrating is that most of the heat pump manufacturers use proprietary controls. So they want to sell you their special thermostat, and you can't just connect it to some third-party thermostat without it actually impacting the performance of the equipment, if it works at all. So with that as a disclaimer, I will also say it was a very insightful tag-on portion of the question, which asked about whether or not there's even anything to gain if you can do that. And the short answer that I give to people is not really. There can be some very small benefits, but the main benefit that we see with smart thermostats is in helping you with setbacks, right? So anything from occupancy controls to, occupancy sensors to, better scheduling, smart scheduling. Theoretically, a smart thermostat doesn't save any more than a programmable thermostat. It's just that, generally speaking, people don't generally set up their programmable thermostat properly. So it kind of takes some of the, human error out of it, I guess. I think that's the kindest way I can say it. So we don't really want to use setbacks, at least not daily setbacks with heat pumps. I didn't really get into the explanation of why. I did explain that they do kind of hum along at steady state. But what I didn't say is that that's how they want it. That's how they really want to operate. That's how they're the most efficient. Heat pumps use a lot of energy when they get into what we call a recovery mode, which is when they find themselves kind of well below the set point. So for example, in my house, we set, if you set back to 60 degrees at night, when you come back in the morning and you want it to be 68, the heat pump says, whoa, I'm 8 degrees off of set point, and it ramps up into like an overdrive mode. It runs the compressor at 110% of its kind of rated capacity, sucks a huge amount of energy. It's the least efficient operation because it's struggling to provide that comfort. So there's a lot of conversation, not to go too much on a tangent or get into too much detail, but there's some nuance about sort of a smart recovery and kind of incrementally raising the temperature to recover. But we're not quite there yet. And I think the simple answer is just find your whatever temperature it is with your heat pump that you're comfortable at, leave it alone. If you're going away for overnight or multiple days, setting it back makes sense. You're going to save more energy than you'll lose during the recovery period. But generally speaking, I say for anything like a daily normal setback, it's not worth it. But going away for 24 hours is worth it or more.
Very interesting. And I know exactly what you're talking about when you think you're being efficient by lowering your temperature, right? But oh, no. So that's a helpful tip. And we're down to our last Q&A question. So we might be, just wrapping up right at 1:15 if that works for folks. And I think this question you'll like a lot, Jake. So Paul asks, using the displacement model and acknowledging that it will vary by home, what is generally the point at which it makes sense to use your traditional heat source versus your heat pump?
Yes. So again, answering a question with a question depends on what your goals are. So for people that are looking to maximize the amount of fossil fuel that they're offsetting, otherwise you could say, you know, having the largest impact on their carbon footprint, that would be one answer. The other question, the other way of looking at it is where do you reach cost parity? In other words, at what point does the operation of the heat pump technically starting to cost you more than if you were to switch over to your other fuel? So, and the answer is going to be different based on which of those things you're trying to accomplish. So again, with that kind of putting the question back to you, I often throw around 5 degrees as a really kind of common sweet spot. It's not a one size fits all. It depends on many factors. How expensive your existing fuel is, which heat pump you get, the size of that heat pump, the building that it's heating, how much of that space in the building that you're trying to heat. All of those things change the equation. But 5 degrees is often the temperature that I encourage contractors and homeowners to think about when sizing equipment, is to pick equipment that's going to provide adequate heating for whatever the goals are, down to 5 degrees. Now that said, that's not carved in stone. There are things that really dramatically can change that. If you have, I know you don't have natural gas down in your neck of the woods, but where I live, we have gas and it's extremely cheap. And so the advice that we give to people with gas can often be, unless you want to spend a lot more on your heating, you might want to swap over at something more like 20 or 30 degrees. So that's my kind of not quite answer.
That was great.
Yeah.
And seeing that we don't have any more questions in the chat, I'll start to wrap up and say thank you. Jake, that was fabulous. I'm so happy that we had you do this, because as soon as the first question came in, I was like, whoop, I'm glad we have an expert, because that would not have been answered half as well by me. So I'm excited that we actually have another one of these coming up. So if folks love this and you need more heat pump, we're actually doing another one of these presentations next week with the Norwich Energy Committee. More likely though, if you have friends or someone who is interested in heat pumps that you'd like to send information to them so they can attend, please go ahead and do that.
Becca, before we sign off, I do see a couple more questions that we
did I miss some?
did miss.
Oh.
So there was one from Teresa.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
That can be so I've heard that we did address this to a certain extent. We addressed the noise issue, but there's also the second part of it is that I've heard that they can significantly increase one's electric bill and may not necessarily decrease one's energy bill. What is your experience with this? And I don't want to let that one go, because I think it's something we've all heard probably from different people. So there's nothing really magic about using a heat pump. As ultimately there's going to be one of a few different results, right? You're either going to heat the space up more than it ever was before, and that could drive up your energy costs, or you're going to maintain the same level of heating, and it's now being done by the heat pump and not your other heating system, right? So it's not just additive, it's replacing something, unless you used to keep the house at 60 and now you're keeping it at 70. And so the only other factors are, is there something potentially wrong with the heat pump where it's operating at some really, really poor efficiency? I think people get stressed about that because they see a big, my bill went up $150 a month or $200 a month. you know, generally speaking, that isn't really, it's just so uncommon. People tend to think that that's the issue, but it really very, very rarely is. I will say that if you're really looking to optimize performance, a single zone heat pump is better than a multi-zone heat pump. And the question as it relates to seeing your other energy bills not go down as much, I think this is where it becomes very difficult for the average person to kind of like really get a grasp of this. And it's the reason why is because of just the way the signals we get are so varied. One is a monthly bill that we see that's very regular, and all of a sudden we see it jump up, right? And there's just that immediate kind of feedback loop versus with a bulk delivery of fossil fuels, whether you're talking propane or oil, you get these sort of, most people are not on a monthly delivery cycle. They're filling up twice, 3 times a year. It's difficult to know when you end a season and then you had a full tank versus an empty tank. It can be a whole nother fill up or not in that following season. You know, we even struggle when we do sort of analyses of different projects. We need to see multiple years of heating deliveries. We actually tie the amount of fuel that's used to the heating degree days, which has to do with essentially what the temperature is at any given time. So we can actually tie the gallons of fuel used to how cold it was. And without doing that, it just becomes very difficult to kind of tangibly compare what your electric bill went up versus what your oil bill went down. But I can tell you that, again, this is pretty straight physics. If you're keeping your building steady in temperature, you're going to see your electric bill go down, your electric bill go up, but less than your oil bill goes down. And again, it also depends on how much you're paying for those things. If you have expensive electricity and cheap, very cheap oil or gas, it might not be as compelling for you as if you're paying, when the propane was $4 a gallon. So anyway, that's my, this comes up quite often.
I'm so happy you jumped in, and apologies, Teresa. I see you're still here, so I'm glad we got to that. One thing
was one more here from David about basement cellar temperature.
Yeah.
So again, a great question. So as we learned in that little science section, if for folks who followed it, the heat energy is coming from essentially the ambient space, or it's wherever you're collecting, or wherever that evaporator is. For heat pump water heaters, it is the space that the thing is operating in. So it is the water, the heat that's going into the water is coming out of the basement, simply put. So the cooler your basement is, the harder the water heater has to work to get energy out of it, and the colder it's going to make the space that it's in. So, a couple of things. One, 50 degrees doesn't concern me particularly. The units are going to work fine as long as they don't get down anywhere near kind of freezing temperatures. If you're seeing freezing temperatures in your basement, we need to be talking to you about a home performance project or some kind of weatherization. You shouldn't be getting that cold in your basement. You need to separate the inside from the outside a little bit better in your basement. And that will have lots and lots of benefits in addition to running a better performance for your heat pump water heater. The other part of the question, which is how much is it going to cool it down? That again depends on how much volume you have in your basement. If it's a teeny tiny little space, it's going to cool it down more than if you have a big, huge open space. But the general guideline is 3 to 5 degrees in reduction in temperature while the unit's running, and then it kind of normalizes and kind of evens back out. So while it's running, I've tracked my own, runs about 3 hours a day. So during that 3 out of 24 hours, it'll drop down 3 to 5 degrees, depending on how big your space is, and then it will recover in the other 21 hours.
Thank you, Jake. And one other piece that I did want to touch base on with your response earlier to Teresa, which I've heard from a lot of folks, is if you've never had an air conditioner or air conditioning in your home in the summer to do cooling, I've definitely run into Vermonters who they do see an increase in their electricity costs, not necessarily because they're properly using their heat pump to heat, but because they've fallen in love with the fact that they can now cool their homes. So if you are not used to having an air conditioner, or you're just kind of opening your windows when it's hot out, a heat pump will be a great addition to your comfort, but you might actually be increasing some of your costs because you're in love with the fact that you can now be nice and cool in certain parts of your building that you weren't before. So I did want to add that. And did I miss anybody else, Jake? Or
I don't know. I think that was all of them. The one other point on that, on the cooling piece, is absolutely, if you haven't been air conditioning, it's going to increase your costs. There's no way around that. I will say that as air conditioners, they cannot be beat from a performance perspective. So they're the quietest air conditioner. They're the most efficient air conditioner. They are the least hassle and the best kind of comfort experience in terms of that ability to modulate. So if air conditioning is on your list of wants and desires, it is the best way to do it is with a heat pump. But you will pay something for it. And again, that said, the efficiency in cooling mode is far and above better than what you have in heating mode. And many customers, not all, but many, report back that they see zero difference in their electric bill because there's just such, I mean, we live in Vermont. It's not Arizona. We don't have that much cooling load. So it doesn't drive, you're not going to drive it up by hundreds. It would be by tens of dollars. So.
Ah, great point. And who doesn't like to think about summer coming our way soon? I mean, whoa.
I want to turn my air conditioner on.
We want to do it. And we've gotten even more. So I'll just start by saying, I'm noticing a lot of detailed questions, and that's great. And I'm actually going to put in the chat while Jake responds to a few of the questions, information about our virtual home energy visits. So those are free. And so if you've gotten some, a taste of what you want to know tonight, you can actually have an energy consultant from Efficiency Vermont come to your phone or laptop or device to actually talk with you about specifics for your home. So if you're not getting exactly the right answer for your specific situation tonight, we can have someone follow up. You can also just call customer support. So I'm going to put that information in the chat. But how about we start with some questions that have been put in the chat. And I see a few here. Let's start with Heather. Are the water-based heat pumps available in the US yet to preheat the water from an oil-based hot water board system? I think you may have tackled a bit of this question. So she talks about the Mitsubishi Econ Dan and says it seems like a great solution for a lot of older Vermont homes. So,
Yep. So there definitely are a number of what we call air to water heat pumps. We can probably drop into the chat as well or follow up later with a link to some of our, our list of qualified products. But we have a number of manufacturers that we've been working with. The EcoDon that you referenced, the Mitsubishi, is not yet available in the US, though there are others. Once you get into hot water, or what we call hydronic heating, just a fancy term for that, hydronic heating is very, very flexible, and depending on how that system is designed, the heat pump can be used as a preheater or a standalone heater. So there's all sorts of ways to sort of skin that cat, so to speak. So those products are definitely out there. If you don't have radiant floors or a system that's designed to operate on low water temperature, and when I say low, I mean something in the 110, 120 degree range, you're going to be into looking at probably some distribution changes or some fancy mechanical design using things like injection valves and all sorts of other stuff. So all doable. I used to have a plumber. I was a building contractor for a long time. My plumber used to say, it's only time and money, right? So, and you can do anything with enough time and money.
Oh, and I was gonna pick on you about your 120-year-old home. Yeah, it's like how you got to start saying 121 by the next time.
Yeah, true.
Okay, and so then we have a question following up. Heather asks, will the ground source heat pumps get water to the 170 degrees Fahrenheit that older hot water baseboard systems need? So I think you talked about that.
I didn't mention in the context of ground source heat pumps, but generally no. Again, these heat pumps are all operating in a very similar kind of range, somewhere around that, up to about 130, or really pushing it up to 140 degrees, but not 170. That said, there are products out there like booster type systems. So there's actually a secondary refrigerant cycle. We're really not, I would say, generally speaking, we're just not quite there yet where we're plug and play, that you can just take your boiler out and put a heat pump system of any sort in that's going to produce 170 degree water. We can get there in other ways, and I do think that we will eventually get there with sort of a direct swap out type situation, but that equipment is just not available in the US yet, at least.
Well, there we go. Soon. It sounds like there's lots of exciting things on the horizon.
Yeah.
And hey, here's a quick one, which I would love to know, as someone who has a heat pump hot water heater, what is the lifespan of a heat pump or a water heater? So I assume is there a difference between the two of those even?
So I think what was meant, so as far as like a ductless heat pump, generally speaking, we use 15 years as a value, as kind of a placeholder value. There's no reason to think that the equipment couldn't last substantially longer than that, especially if it was properly maintained. Most warranties are generally in the 5 to 10 year range, kind of 7 being a kind of a normal average, although we have been seeing them push up to about 10 years. So 10, 15 years, you might start having some issues, because that seems to be the way things go, but there's no reason to think that it would be end of life. You just may have some service and some repairs. Similar for heat pump water heaters. Again, a lot of this equipment hasn't been around that long, so it's a bit hard to put a really clear, obvious number on it. But again, keep in mind, think about something like a heat pump water heater. Water heaters have been around for a long time. We know how long materials last. The heat pump itself is not all that different, again, than your refrigerator. So how long do refrigerators last? I think we use an average value of 13 years, but I'll admit to you all, I have a beer fridge in my basement that's probably 30 years old. So, and that thing works great. I will say, I did retrofit it with a lot of additional polyurethane foam, so it's way better insulated. So I think it's probably better than a brand new fridge. That's my theory.
And somehow a question just popped into the chat about what your favorite microbrew is. No.
Oh, so many. I am pretty excited. For those of you that are not familiar, we just moved our main headquarters to Winooski. And Winooski has some amazing microbreweries. And in particular, I'm excited about the Four Quarters Brewery. If you haven't seen Four Quarters, you should check it out.
Hey, that was...
The beer lovers out there.
And you've gotten a good Efficiency Vermont new office plug. Well done.
Of course, I've never been in that space. We technically moved last March, not this March, but 13 months ago, and I still haven't been there.
One day we'll see our office.
Mm-hmm.
And we have questions from Larry. It sounds like, Larry, you're right in, you're thinking about it. And you've also, you're starting to look at a heat pump, or you have a heat pump installed or will be installed. So I'm going to read the first of your questions and see if we can get the second one in. So Larry says, I have a modern fuel oil furnace and a wood stove. Currently, it's a roughly 50-50 split for my winter heat. Soon will be 90% heat pump when it's installed. So moving that over. And his question is, can I wire in my oil furnace to run automatically in cold spells when the heat pump needs supplementation, even if I'm out of town, or is there a better solution?
Larry, that is a great question. It's something that you've zoomed in on that is actually very near and dear to my heart, that I've been working on for several years. That's just coming to fruition later this year. So let me talk a little bit about that, and I'll tell you, I think that's going to be really the solution you're going to want to go with in the long term. If that's not something you are either able to get access to or you're not interested, there are some other alternatives. So what I'm talking about is what we call integrated controls. So integrated controls is really identified the need to integrate existing central systems with these new heat pumps with a single controller. Because the way it normally works now, of course, is that for those of you that have a heat pump, you've probably been through this experience where you got the heat pump installed, maybe you were there or not there when installation happened. And when you got home, there was a remote control and an operations manual, and maybe even an invoice and a little note that says, enjoy your new heat pump. And that's it. And you kind of have this remote control that runs this, and you look at these little pictures of snowflakes and sunshines, and you try to figure out how to operate this thing, because no one removed anything else. So you still have everything else you had, now you have this. How does that all work? It can be very bewildering for a lot of people. Another plug, we do have a great document. It's titled 8 Ways Not to Use Your Heat Pump. That's a really great resource for people to kind of help figure out how to navigate that. Problem is that it doesn't really fix, it's a great resource and it's super helpful when we don't have a technology solution. But what we really need is a way to tie those systems together, to integrate those controls into a single controller, where you can set your parameters in the controller, and then you just tell it what temperature you want, and the system just does what it needs to do to run the heat pump, run the furnace. You don't have to worry about whether you're there or not there. And you can really optimize the use of these, optimizes the use of your heat pump. So this has been something I've been working with manufacturers and controls manufacturers to make this available for literally probably about 5 or 6 years now. And we're finally starting to see products coming out on the market. There's a lot of recognition that this is really critical need. And so we are planning to launch a small scale, but roll out a rebate program later this year, probably early fall. So stay tuned for that. If that gets delayed or that doesn't work for you, Larry, I would say that the alternative option that most people use, this is sort of the poor man's integrated controls, which is to set your furnace temperature. 5 to 10 degrees is really safe. 5 degrees starts to get a little, kind of edges towards staying more comfortable, but somewhere in that 5 to 10 degree, you could split the difference, call it 7 degrees. Set it 7 degrees lower than what you have your heat pump set at. Then if you go away and it got really cold and the heat pump couldn't keep up, when it started to get down about 7 degrees below your set temperature, that furnace would automatically kick back on. So that's sort of the backup plan.
That's great, having a backup plan.
Yeah.
And I put that article in the chat that Jake just mentioned, 8 ways not to use a heat pump. Very quick and educational read. And then Larry actually had a follow-up question. And he asked, can a heat pump use my current hot water radiators to distribute heat to the 4 zones, domestic water heater in my house?
Yes. If you go to an air to water heat pump, the system and the zone valves and the piping is really just part of the hydronic design. That's the distribution design. The heat pump at that point is just your heat plant. It's like replacing, it's like the boiler. It's just creating hot water, and then you can turn on zone pumps, zone valves. You can have as many zones as you want. You can heat domestic hot water. You can heat different zones to different temperatures, all the things that you can do with any other type of system. So I've seen, seems like heating contractors themselves have seen their homes, they have, 10 zones of heating or something ridiculous like that. So.
Well, there you go. And then we have a question from Chris. He says, oh, isn't okay. And speaking of that kind of zoned heating question, what heat pump approach would you suggest for a family that is a propane boiler with a zone for hot water and window air conditioners?
Yeah. So, Chris, you know what my answer is going to be, right? I would have to know what it is. I'd have to talk to the customer to know what their goal was. Is this person's goal to get heat, sort of better cooling, more centralized cooling? Is their goal to completely get off of fossil fuels? There are a lot of opportunities with that home, which is, I would say, a pretty standard Vermont home, right? Propane boiler, running a zone for hot water. Depending on what their distribution looks like, if they have radiant floors and a system that's designed to operate, under 120 degrees during peak conditions, I would say that's a great option for an air to water heat pump. I am not, or even a water to water heat pump. I'm not a huge fan of trying to run domestic hot water off of these units. I think the standalone units just sort of simplify the whole system. So.
And Jake, just to throw it in there, because Chris, he's listening, he's snapping with us. He says, I want to get off fossil fuels, and his baseboard hydronic radiators. So, yeah. But again, we can certainly connect you with a virtual home energy visit. So Jake can answer it, but you might want some more specifics.
I also happen to know Chris and know that he does home energy visits. So he's somebody, he's setting me up here, but I appreciate the questions. So of course, Chris, the other option that we could employ are ductless heat pumps. These can be a really, really cost-effective solution for offsetting the air conditioning, obviously. Not so much, obviously, for the hot water. For that, I think you really can't beat a heat pump water heater, unless you're on a slab, which most buildings in Vermont, especially if you have an older building, is not. But a heat pump water heater can be a great option for the domestic hot water portion. So, yeah.
Well, I will say, Chris put in the chat that he doesn't know as much as you. So you've got you've got some good audience members. Well done, folks. And just to note, it is 8. And if you were planning on leaving at 8 and you have a burning question, you can, if you want to be courageous and raise your blue hand, I'm happy to take your question if you want to say it to us. But we have a question in the chat. Oh, wow. As soon as I looked away from the Q&A, you came in with more questions. So I'm going to follow up with Peggy, who asked earlier. She says, have you worked with heat pumps that are add-ons to an already in place electric hot water heater? So you're not relying entirely on the heat pump heater. What kind of, there's a follow-up question about temperature in there, but I don't know if you want to get to that first.
I am familiar with those products. I believe the product you're referring to, there was really only one that made a shot at that I was ever familiar with. Company out of Maine called Nile. They produced a product called Geyser, which is exactly what you're referring to. I was pretty optimistic about this product at first. You know, I will say that I think it adds a good deal of complexity, and although it's possible, I don't even know what the status of that. I haven't heard anything about. Nile is definitely still around. I haven't heard anything about the Geyser product for probably 3 or 4 years. So my sense is that the market just didn't really quite adopt that. I will take the opportunity to say there are, although we focused today on the packaged or those hybrid systems where you have the heat pump attached right to the unit, there are other versions out there. There are versions that operate more like a ductless mini split, where you actually have an outside component that is actually collecting the heat energy from the outside air and then bringing it in and then just heating up a tank of water. There's a company, only one right now that I'm familiar with, company called Sanden, Japanese company. And what's unique about that, in addition to being split, is they're using a very environmentally benign type of refrigerant. Some of the refrigerants, we didn't get really into this. The refrigerant's supposed to stay in the pipe, right? I said it's not something that you use up. It's supposed to stay in there. Those refrigerants, when it can leak out, just like anything can break. And when they do leak out, they can have some really very negative impacts from a global warming perspective. So we really are very conscious of that. We don't want to undermine the whole decarbonization intent of the technology by having kind of the opposite impact. I will say that because these products tend to be offsetting the use of fossil fuels, the net benefit is there, even if you do have the occasional leak, but we do want to mitigate that as much as possible. And one way we can do that is by moving to what we call natural refrigerants. It's a whole new class of refrigerants that this particular product uses. So in addition to being split and having this natural refrigerant, they also produce very, very hot water. They can produce hot water up to, I think, 108, 179 degrees. So this is why we are so confident that the technology is not that far out to be able to produce hot water for your building. In fact, there are people who are using these products, kind of rigging them to use them as a way to heat up your building. Not really ideal. There are a variety of reasons why that doesn't work that well, but it does work. We have buildings in Vermont that are heated by these systems. So it is possible.
Well, Jake,
long-winded answer.
No, I was going to say, you actually hit, there you go. You hit Peggy's second follow-up question, which was, what kind of temperature can you generally maintain with a heat pump hot water heater? You got it.
Well, a standard heat pump water heater is going to run generally up to, I think the highest setting on those is about 150 degrees. Okay. So, and don't try to heat your building with those. That's like when I've gotten that question before. Well, can I heat my building with my water heater? Remember where it's getting its heat from. It's getting it from the building. So you can't really heat the building with the heat energy that you're taking from the building. It's sort of like trying to lift yourself up. It just doesn't work very well.
But the magic there. Oh, okay. And then we actually did get a question about refrigerants. So at our last presentation, we also got this question, and very impressed that folks are thinking this forward. Heather asked, so you talked a little bit about this, but if you want to elaborate, we did get that question. Can you talk about the refrigerants used in heat pumps? Are there any available yet that use carbon dioxide instead of more climate impacting older refrigerant chemicals?
Another topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I spend a lot of time working on this exact issue. So I will say that for the vast majority of heat pumps, almost all of them are what's called or R410A. That's just a designation that defines the components. R410A is part of a larger group of refrigerants called HFCs, or hydrofluorocarbons. Hydrofluorocarbons were initially brought on to replace other synthetic chemical-based refrigerants that had a negative impact on poking a hole in the ozone layer. I'm sure you all, or many of you, remember CFCs, and they used to be everything, hairspray, and you name it. Those were all phased out and were replaced with these more environmentally benign, at least that was the thinking at the time, refrigerants, this whole HFC class. It's true, they have zero impact on the ozone. So the ozone is coming back. It's been a huge success from an environment, a world that doesn't seem to do very well with a lot of global environmental catastrophes, because that really was a global effort to counteract that. Unfortunately, we were placed with HFCs, which have a tremendously negative impact from a global warming perspective. And just to put it in a sense of scale, R410A, if you compare it to the most normal carbon greenhouse gas that we think of, which is carbon dioxide, pound for pound, it's over 2,000 times worse. So a pound of R410A being released is the equivalent of about 2,000 pounds of carbon dioxide being released. So again, horrible, something we are working very hard to sort of shift to the next phase of next generation of refrigerants. The industry is always very slow to adopt. I don't think it's something that should stop us from moving forward with making the decision to put in heat pumps, for the reason that I did mention earlier, that the net benefit, if we're offsetting fossil fuels, don't continue to use fossil fuels because you're afraid of that potential impact. It's still a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. So as far as the question about CO2 as a refrigerant, the system that I was just talking about earlier, that split system water heater, that is CO2 based. So we're seeing carbon dioxide as a refrigerant getting used in commercial refrigeration, actually, on a pretty regular basis. Some of the new grocery stores that you may have shopped at are actually using carbon dioxide based systems that we assisted with. So it's coming. It's very well suited to the refrigeration side. Every refrigerant's got different characteristics. Not as ideal for heating air. Seems to be good for heating water. Waiting for some products that are really designed as heat pumps for space heating that use carbon dioxide. We just don't have them in the US yet.
Okay. And again, we had that question last time, and I learned even more the second time. Ooh.
Yeah, that's why I told everybody last time they had to come again the second time.
Yeah.
Always better always more information, better information.
Wow. And I'll mention this book again as well. If you haven't read or at least skimmed The Drawdown, which is edited by Paul Hawkins, that was the first place that I really learned that refrigerants, in the conversation around refrigerants as it relates to global warming. Great book if you haven't checked it out.
Yeah, Project Drawdown. You can look up, they have a great website as well. They define the top 100 sort of actions that can be taken to counteract climate change, and number one on that entire list was refrigerant management. So above energy efficiency and renewables and even educating women in the third world. We're going to have more impact with refrigerant management, bang for your buck, than anything else. So it's a big deal.
You're in a good line of work then. Glad we have you. And we have a question from Charlie. And they ask, what are your thoughts regarding 30 amp versus 15 amp heat pump hot water heaters?
Yeah, so what this is in reference to is the fact that a lot of people who are interested in putting in heat pump water heaters are really often referred to as hybrid water heaters. And the reason they're referred to as hybrid water heaters is because they do have that heat pump, but they also have conventional electric resistance elements, very similar, usually an upper and lower element, about 2,500 watts each. So they have about a 5,000 watt draw if you're actually using the elements themselves. And that's what a sort of normal electric water heater is. In order to pull that kind of power, generally speaking, you're using a 220 circuit, right? Two breakers in your panel. You're pulling two hot leads. So that really, when they first developed these hybrid water heaters, the idea was to do a 1-for-1 replacement with electric water heaters, because that's what most people in the US have, are standard electric water heaters. So you take the old one out, the wire that was there, you just put it right in. The assumption was that you've got the breaker space and the panel and everything's good to go. So for those of us that maybe didn't have an electric water heater, that had a propane fired water heater or something like some customer said earlier, a zone off of either propane boiler or oil boiler, now we have to go looking for panel space in order to get this water heater hooked up, which can be very problematic if you already have a fully loaded panel, sometimes even already double tap breakers. So the cost of installing a heat pump water heater might have just gone up by several $1,000s, because now you're putting a whole new panel in, sometimes even a new service. So so what this Charlie is referring to here is there's been a identified need for a number of years for what they call retrofit heat pump water heaters, which is that they plug into a traditional 110 circuit. So I think some of them even do have like appliance plugs. So you could just, as long as you have an outlet somewhere, you plug the thing in. They don't even need to be hardwired. It's a great solution. I think there are some compromises on performance that come as a result of that, but it's better to do that than not do anything because you don't have the panel space. So I guess I would say my thoughts are go with, a traditional double 30, 220 system if you can, without having to upgrade your entire system. If you can't, there's a few options that are coming onto the market now for 110. So
great. Well,
hope I answered the question. I think I did.
And feel free, Charlie, if you see this, you can pop something in the chat. And then I think we're down to our last question. And it's from Dylan. And Dylan asks a question that I really appreciate, thinking of those older homes. Dylan says, we live in a house built in the 1950s that is mostly brick and on a slab. Are there any realistic options for insulation, air sealing masonry walls, short of framing and insulating the interior? So a bit of a weatherization question here. If we were to do air sealing only the attic, could we achieve a tight enough envelope to both benefit from rebates and heat pumps, which they would love to pair with solar?
Yeah, I did spend the earlier part of my career at Efficiency Vermont evaluating, working on what we call our Home Performance with Energy Star program. So this is the program that does residential retrofits. So I did look at a lot. I was in a lot of houses back when we used to go to people's houses, if anyone can remember back that long. And I did, of course, see a lot of buildings that would sort of fit this general characterization, right? Masonry walls, what can you really do? And it is a challenge. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat that one. Depending on the type of brick you have, sometimes insulating can be actually a bad thing, because now the brick can actually begin freeze-thaw cycles because it's not getting as much access to heat in the way that it used to keep it sort of, essentially the brick would stay warm all winter long because you'd be losing so much heat. Some brick, if you actually insulate the inside really well, that brick actually now can, if it gets saturated with water, can go through freeze-thaw cycles and you can start to have your bricks crumbling, right? So this can be a really bad thing. So I would say, even if there are opportunities to insulate, sometimes you should get your brick tested. The Building Science Corporation provides, I think, a masonry testing service. At least they used to. So I'm sure there are others. I just happen to know that one off the top of my head. So that said, there are some innovative ways of getting insulation in there. Sometimes, I mean, usually there's wood framing on the interior. I would assume you're not just looking at brick on both sides. If you are, you really may want to consider that idea of framing and insulating. But again, I know that sort of kills the vibe of the brick house and the feel of it. So, and we don't want your brick to crumble. So, hard one to answer without kind of getting into more details about exactly whether we're talking about structural brick or brick veneer. But let's just assume that you can't do anything to insulate the walls. I would say do everything else that you can. So you're right on track with going after the attic. Of course, you can't do your basement because you don't have one. There are opportunities to do things. There's something called an Alaskan slab or wing insulation, so you can actually excavate just like a foot down outside around the exterior of the home, lay in foam board, buried foam board insulation kind of in the ground to keep the frost away. It's mostly for frost protection, but it can improve thermal performance just by kind of keeping the ground underneath the house a little bit warmer. Once you've exhausted sort of all those options, I would say at that point, you just need to properly size your heating equipment to meet the needs of the building, right? So you're going to want to evaluate what are the heat loads of your building after that's all done. A good heating contractor will help you out with that. And properly size your heat pumps to meet your needs. So absolutely, we have rebates to help you out with any number of different portions of all the things that I just mentioned, including the building evaluation, weatherization, the heat pumps, the rebates. So absolutely.
We got it all. Check out the website. The amount of times yeah, I know, it's a lifesaver. And I think that's our last question. So I really want to thank everyone who joined us, our 15 stalwarts who stuck it out until now out of our original 30 plus. You're the heroes of the evening. And just I'll end with another big thank you to Jake. You're a wealth of knowledge. I'm going to put my contact information, though. I apologize, folks, but you get me. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to find the right answer for you. And again, as we just mentioned, the website is great. Customer support is on it. So you can also reach out through those channels. And with that, I would thank Linda for being our fabulous host in the whole Norwich Energy Committee. This is our second one of these, and I'll be sharing out the slides with all of the attendees from both groups in PDF, and we're going to work on getting the recording as well. So yeah, Linda, did you want to wrap up with any final words?
just a huge thank you, because like, once again, this was extremely informative. I'm going to echo Becca's comments that Jake, listening to you multiple times is a joy and very educational. So I just appreciate it a ton. And I think it's clear that, you know, all our participants, you know, they had detailed questions, and that's great to see. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely. And I spared you all my heat pump jokes. I'll have to do those for the theoretical third session, maybe next year.
Hey, it's a quick drive for these webinars, so we can do.
You stand up as well. It's like all heat pumps all the time.
Oh, well, thanks everybody, and have a good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.